Putin is humiliated as Ukrainian saboteurs launch a surprise attack deep into Russian territory. Ukrainian military embarrassed the Russian president on Tuesday by conducting a 6-mile march into Russian territory in the Kursk area. In a dramatic escalation, around 300 Ukrainian forces launched a surprise cross-border incursion into a hitherto calm stretch of the front on Tuesday, reaching as far as 6 miles, 10 kilometers, into Russian territory, according to Moscow. Russia's Ministry of Defense claimed late Tuesday that the attack, which began at 8 a.m., was carried out by up to 300 Ukrainian militants from Ukraine's 22nd Mechanized Brigade. The attack force was boosted by 11 tanks and over 20 armored combat vehicles. Combat continued throughout the day between the border towns of Nikolaevo-Daryiino-Noleshnya in Russia's Kursk area, reaching to the outskirts of Sudza, some 10 kilometers from the front line. The assault also seems to have damaged several Russian trucks carrying tanks. In an embarrassing moment for Vladimir Putin, Russian claims of effectively repelling the assault were swiftly refuted. According to Russian military bloggers and social media video, the Ukrainian onslaught was considerable, albeit the extent of its continuation is unknown. According to The Guardian, Rybar, a popular Russian military blogger, said that by Tuesday evening, the situation in the Kursk area was tense, with fights taking place in border regions. Judging by the latest footage, Ukrainian formations have managed to advance, Rybar stated, contradicting Moscow's early claims. According to Russia's defense ministry, the Ukrainian sabotage squad returned to their region after incurring casualties. According to the statement, some fighters tried to take up positions near the state boundary but were stopped by Russian armed troops. Ukraine's political authorities and Ministry of Defense have not yet issued a public statement. However, Andriy Kovalenko, chief of the anti-disinformation section of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, admitted the attack's existence, implying that it had not been completely vanquished. Kovalenko went on to say that Russian forces are lying about the situation in the Kursk area being under their control. Russia does not control the border. According to military experts, the offensive might be intended to redirect Russian troops to defend an underactive portion of the front till spring 2022, boosting Ukrainian morale. However, opponents in Ukraine believe that such attacks provide little long-term military gain. In March, anti-Kremlin Russian militants conducted failed assaults from Ukraine on the Belgorod and Kursk areas. A Russia without Russians? Putin's demographics are bad. Russia's future will be defined by a lower population. Russian President Vladimir Putin's conflict has almost certainly ensured that Russia's population would be not just smaller, but also older, more vulnerable, and less educated in future generations. It will almost definitely be less Russian and more religiously diverse. While some may perceive variety as a plus, many Russians disagree. In a world when millions of people are fleeing conflict, persecution, poverty, and the growing effects of climate change, xenophobic political rhetoric sells well. Putin has regularly discussed Russia's demographic challenges since becoming president. Despite spending billions of rubles on high-profile, national projects to address the issue, population loss persisted. Putin's timetable for armed intervention in Ukraine may have reflected an assumption that Russia's demographic and economic position would not improve over the following 2 decades. However, the fighting is exacerbating an already severe predicament. The demographic implications of Russia's conflict against Ukraine, like those of World Conflict II, as well as the impact on health, birth rate, and life expectancy from Russia's lengthy transformation in the 1990s, will be felt for centuries. Russia's population will continue to drop throughout the 21st century, with ethnic Russians making up a lower fraction of that population. The ethnic and religious groups who support Putin's traditional family values are mostly non-Russian. According to United Nations projections, Russia's population in 2100 would be between 74 million and 112 million, compared to 146 million now. According to the most current UN forecasts, the world's population will fall by around 20% by 2100. Russia is expected to have a 25 to 50% decrease. While Russia is not alone in experiencing falling birth rates and an aging population, as well as high adult mortality and infertility among both men and women, the country's predicament is made much more difficult by restricted immigration and ongoing brain drain. Natural variables such as birth rates and life expectancy, as well as the immigration-immigration balance, all contribute to population growth. Putin's assault in Ukraine has weakened all major sources of population growth. Since Putin took office, demographic policy has seen four significant turning points. The first occurred in 2006, when Putin's rhetoric on demography was translated into practical policies. Demography was one of the first four national initiatives he announced. The second big alteration occurred with Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. The response to such aggression in Ukraine, Moldova, and other former Soviet republics reduced the number of nations that supplied labor to Russia. A third watershed event was the Crocus City Hall terrorist assault outside Moscow in March 2024. Tajiks accounted for half of all immigration to Russia in 2023, although this has become politically difficult since the Crocus incident. The most recent policy changes coincided with the establishment of a new administration in May 2024. Initial reports indicate a long-term strategy that may begin to acknowledge Russia's new demographic realities. It comes too late, and the suggested steps do not provide fresh answers. The article opens with an overview of the demographic issues that the Russian Federation inherited from the Soviet Union, as well as its unsuccessful early reaction. The second part discusses the worsening scenario after 2013. The final part discusses how Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine is increasing all of these issues. The conclusion explains how population loss will affect Russia's future. Addressing the Soviet legacy. Throughout the 20th century, the Soviet Union underwent a number of demographic shocks. Following Joseph Stalin's death, recovery seemed feasible. However, by the 1960s, Russia's high newborn mortality and poor adult life expectancy stood out among other highly industrialized nations. The demographic shock of World War II reverberated for decades. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's anti-alcohol drive in 1986 to 1987 resulted in a modest increase in life expectancy, but it was insufficient to shift the dynamic. Economic difficulties, starting with Gorbachev's perestroika and lasting until the 1990s, led to fewer births, greater mortality, and substantial emigration. The fall of the Soviet Union resulted in huge population movement, with millions of Russians and non-Russians returning to their own homelands. Every former Soviet republic became increasingly racially homogeneous. This tendency has continued inside the Russian Federation, where certain non-Russian republics are becoming less Russian. Russians transferring inside the Russian Federation have lowered the population of the Far East. Russia's immigration-emigration balance incorporates a number of demographic fluxes. Russians have returned to Russia from the newly independent former Soviet countries. As Russia's economy developed, labor migrants, particularly from former Soviet countries, found official and informal employment in Russia. Prior to the conflict, immigrants made up for the repeated waves of, mainly Russian, emigration from Russia. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and ultimately the Soviet Union, broke decades-long economic links and supply lines. Economic uncertainty lowered already low birth rates over most of the post-Soviet area. Russia's total fertility rate, TFR, the number of births per woman, fell from slightly below the replacement level in 1988 to 1.3 in 2004. Maintaining population levels needs a TFR of at least 2.1 in the absence of positive net immigration. Russia's high adult death rate necessitates a higher TFR. In his inauguration speech in August 2000, Putin warned that Russia's demographic decrease may render it an enfeebled nation. Despite the warnings, nothing was accomplished. Russia's TFR rose from 1.25 in 2000 to 1.39 in 2007. This minor increase reflected improved economic situations as a result of increasing oil prices, as well as a temporary higher number of women in the 18 to 35 age group. The legacy of Soviet policies has contributed to the ongoing difficulties in increasing birth rates or TFR statistics. Due to a lack of access to effective birth control and male reluctance to condom usage, abortion has become the most common remedy for unwanted births. Murray Feshbach estimated that the Soviet abortion rate averaged 7 per woman. Much little attention has been paid to male infertility. Alcohol and alcohol misuse have led to exceptionally high infertility rates among Russian males. Low birth rates represent just one aspect of the demographic issue. Unhealthy food and lifestyle choices, excessive drinking, and accidents all contribute to the high adult death rate. When Putin was elected president in 2000, Russian men aged 18 to 64 died at 4 times the rate of European men. Russian women were dying at almost the same rate as European males. Until early 2005, Putin's official view was that Russia could counteract its demographic decrease by encouraging more Russians from former Soviet republics to return to Russia, bringing with them necessary skills and supplementing the ethnic Russian population. This immigration helped to counterbalance most of the population loss in the 1990s, but it has steadily fallen since Putin became president. Non-Russians became the primary labor migrants. According to data from the Russian Official Statistics Bureau Goskомstat, legal immigration peaked at 1.147 million in 1994 and has since decreased steadily, reaching 350,900 in 2000 and 70,000 in 2004. Despite the dropping numbers, the Russian government enacted a severely restrictive regulation in 2002 prohibiting legal immigration. When the Security Council debated immigration again in 2005, Putin advocated for a more humane approach, eliminating ethnic and religious restrictions. However, he followed up with a clarification that prioritized Russian speakers. It is probable that Putin recognized the situation but altered his speech to reflect popular sentiment. The Russian media's stories of a big flood of Chinese immigrants in the 1990s were greatly overstated. As oil prices surged in 2000, laborers from Central Asia, Ukraine, and Moldova sought official or informal employment in Russia. Russia integrated the people of Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014 and more regions since 2022, resulting in official claims of a bigger Russian population. Immigrants to Russia have mostly come from former Soviet republics, accounting for 95 to 96% of the total. Between 1989 and 2004, only 5 Soviet Union nations saw population growth: Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Migrants from 2 former Soviet countries with dwindling populations, Ukraine and Moldova, continued to work until 2014. Putin emphasized the significance of demographics in his 2012, 2018, and 2024 inauguration speeches, as well as several of his yearly call-in programs. Several times, he has recognized the inability to meet projected birth rate increases. However, there seems to be no learning curve in terms of policies. Putin's 2024 speech promised more of the same, paying Russians to have bigger families while emphasizing the need for additional troops to preserve the nation. Pre-war policies. As oil prices rose in the 2000s, Putin's administration pondered how to utilize the windfall to confront ongoing demographic issues. Immigration, as in many other nations, is still politically controversial. Russian nationalist organizations used the slogan "Russia for the Russians" in their campaigns. Improving life expectancy is an ideal answer, but it is gradual and costly, requiring individuals to take care of their health. Putin's administration adopted pronatal measures. In his 2006 presidential address, Putin referred to demography as the most serious problem in Russia today. Rather than listening to advisors familiar with the basket of diverse policies that improved birth rates in France and Sweden, prenatal and postnatal care, parental leave, daycare, preschool programs, housing support, and other incentives, Russia's government emphasized maternity capital. The inaugural maternal capital program provided women with incentives for having a second or subsequent child via birth or adoption. The payments, which were provided when a kid reached 3, might be used for housing, the child's education at an approved institution, the mother's pension, or special needs help. Changes throughout time have included money for the first child and better housing. The yearly adjusted subsidy was sufficient to stimulate increased births in rural and small towns, but had little influence in higher-priced metropolitan regions, which account for 70% of the population. Furthermore, many ladies who had given birth at a Russian maternity facility concluded that one was enough. The pronatal strategy corresponded with slightly increased Russian birth rates, increasing the TFR from 1.3 when the maternity capital program began in 2007 to roughly 1.8 in 2015. Most demographers, however, ascribe the greater numbers to a, temporarily, bigger cohort of women in peak childbearing years, economic growth caused by higher oil prices during Putin's first 2 terms, and optimism that widespread demonstrations over the 2011 to 2012 elections heralded meaningful change. After 2012, the lower number of returning countrymen outweighed the increase in births. Despite the expanded maternity capital program, Russia's TFR had decreased to 1.5 by 2019, before to COVID-19 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russian state sources continued to quote the rate as 1.8. Without immigration, even a TFR of 1.8 would reduce Russia's population by 20 to 25% every generation. Life expectancy is the other endogenous factor driving natural population change. Russia is far from the only country suffering declining birth rates. Most nations outside of Africa are expected to have fewer populations in the future decades. Nonetheless, Russia continues to stand out among affluent nations in terms of death rates among individuals aged 18 to 64. Russia's economic recovery under Putin's first 2 years as president resulted in modest improvement. In 1990, Russian men died at 4 times the rate of European men, but by 2022, the rate had just doubled. The minor gains seen during Putin's first 2 administrations were attributed to economic recovery, increased stability, and attempts to enhance healthcare. However, the main emphasis of the healthcare program was not on much-needed primary and preventive care. Instead, the majority of the monies were spent on pricey new equipment, increasing potential for bribery.